All right, everyone. So this will be the Progressive Era lecture. So let me bring that up real quick, share my screen. So the last few chapters have been about the Gilded Age, the last quarter of the 19th century. Again, one of the worst time periods in American history in terms of inequality. It's at an all-time high. Um, we did not yet have all the reforms, like senators were directly elected by citizens. That's the case today. It was not in the late 19th century. Women did not yet have the right to vote. Jim Crow is very much the law of the land at this time. Um, and businesses could just do whatever they wanted to do, essentially. So today, one can debate, are progressives on the side of right or wrong, or conservatives right or wrong? I think nearly all of us can look back to 130 years ago and say that we needed a big dose of progressivism. So today we usually teach the progressive era as this positive, great thing that brought about a lot of change. The track record's a bit more mixed than that. There were certain things that the progressive era did not achieve. There are certain things they did that were just flat out wrong. But on balance, I think we can say that what they achieved was very good. And right here is the most plain example of that, is that women finally, at the climax of the progressive era in 1920, gained the right to vote. And that was a very good thing that had been denied for far too long. But there was far more wrong with America than just that. This is a very famous picture that photojournalist Jacob Riis took, and it changed a lot of people's minds. This is a picture of a tenement house, an apartment in New York City in the 19 teens. And I like to sometimes play a game when I look at this picture, and that is how many people are in the picture. So if you look closely, you can see these two guys here sharing a bed, but then there's the shape of a body here. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There might even be another person there. This was not that uncommon. In the United States, it was very common for a simple one-room tenement house to have 7, 8, 9 people there. If there was a lady of the house, like if there was a married couple and a wife was there and they were sort of renting out space on a floor to other people, the woman would usually be raising rabbits and or chickens inside this place to supplement rent, which would have been pretty gross and not very sanitary. So as you can imagine, disease was rampant in these places. No ventilation, there's no windows. So you have to have like old lamps to light it, fire lamps, that is, no electricity yet. Electricity existed, but only factories, not in people's homes. So as you can imagine, just unbelievably hot. A lot of people just slept outside on fire escapes during this time period. If you were lucky enough to have a building with a fire escape, that was another issue. A lot of buildings went up in a blaze and there were no fire protections or anything, and plaster buildings would just go up in 10 minutes and just everyone would burn to death in these buildings. So there started to begin to be a movement where people said, this is terrible, let's look at this. Prior to this time, the attitude amongst most elites and even middle class waspy Americans was personal responsibility. This is the fault. If there's poverty, it's the fault of the poor. Progressives didn't buy into that as much. They had a soft spot in their hearts for a lot of these people. So Jacob Riis was an immigrant from Denmark, and he started photographing poor kids on the streets of New York City. And then he eventually started taking pictures of the poor in general. He published a book called How the Other Half Lives, and it became a huge sensation. Middle-class people would buy copies of this, and it was like a coffee table book. People would come over and you'd look through a picture book, and a lot of it was homeless kids in the streets. It was workers. It was just how difficult their lives were. Part of the problem was that middle-class people didn't know what it was like to be poor, didn't know any poor people. Society was so segregated in where everybody lived that a lot of middle-class people just didn't know how bad it was. Middle-class people started to get, in the 1870s, a 40-hour work week. They had sanitation, that is flushing toilets in their home. The poor wouldn't get that until after the turn of the 20th century, and the progressive era is what drove a lot of that. So a huge part of this is we want to now talk about it, because before the attitude was, sort of like social Darwinism, right? Like survival of the fittest. And this is really cruel, but the attitude in most universities and through most of the world was, if we help the poor, that will slow down evolution. That the reason why capitalism is the best system in the world is that it most mimics the law of the jungle, right? And so that promotes evolution. If we take away resources from the rich and give it to the poor will have more of an incentive to repopulate. Poor parents will have more poor kids, which will then be a further drain on the system. And eventually poor people will collapse the system because everything was reduced to genetics, right? Everything. Racism is part of this as well, right? That African Americans were deemed as inferior biologically. Likewise, here, they're saying that poverty was biological, that if you had poor parents, you were more likely to have poor kids. Now, there is a link there, but today we would say it's environmental, because if you're poor, you're sending your kids to underperforming schools. They don't have the resources to get out of poverty. And that's why poor kids come from poor families, not that it's genetic, that there's something wrong with your DNA. So the idea was, get this, if we don't feed and take care of the poor, they will die off, the genetically inferior, making the rest of the species better, so don't interfere. That was the idea all through the 1880s and 1890s, and even through the progressive era, that was the main discourse. But now there's a counter discourse, which is, that's ridiculous, that's silly. Because honestly, social Darwinism, the ideology, it falls apart under any kind of scrutiny, right? Like, what about public health laws? It was decided in New York City they needed to have a main water system for everybody and chlorinate everybody's waters so that the poor didn't get disease. Because guess what? If poor people get sick, they're going to get rich people sick. It's not like germs discriminate and say, wait, I can only infect a poor person. No, it's going to infect everybody. And so factory bosses were told, why don't you increase your taxes a little bit and pay for water systems for the poor, and you'll be better off. What a novelty, right? What a system. And it totally flew in the face of social Darwinism, that, survival of the fittest. Lots of other things too, like a fire brigade, right? If you're a rich person and poor people's neighborhood's burning down, that fire is going to spread to your neighborhood. The police, likewise, schools, libraries, all these systems don't operate in a social Darwinist paradigm, and we began to see the virtue of them. So a lot of these periodicals, McClure's, Cosmo, yes, Cosmopolitan used to be actually a news magazine, and it's not, it's like a fashion magazine now, or so I'm told. I've never read one before. Collier, Saturday Evening Post, all of these started to shed a light on these horrible stories. First of all, poison patent medicine. It may surprise you guys to know that in the United States of America, during the Gilded Age, even for a few years afterwards, it was perfectly legal and fine for companies, drug companies, to do whatever the hell they wanted to do. So for instance, number one, they could lie. They could just say, my product cures cancer, it's good for what ails you, cures headaches, cough, fever, etc. And it's nothing. It's like a placebo. It's just a sugar pill. And they have the right to do that. That is highly illegal today. Drug companies cannot advertise that their drug has an effect unless there's clinical trials, and the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, oversees those clinical trials and looks at the evidence and says, okay, you may now say this. It used to be you could just say whatever the hell you wanted to do. It's like the Wild West, like buyer beware. You were lucky if you got the placebo, the sugar pill, because in a lot of cases, these companies would just sell flat out hard drugs. That was legal in America in the 1880s and 1890s. You could sell whatever you wanted. So a lot of these companies, they'd sell like, little mints or cough drops in a little like tin can, almost like Altoids. And you'd go and you buy that from the drugstore, and it would say, cures your headache. You pop one in the morning, you'd say, I feel great. Because you didn't know it was basically heroin that you were using, or cocaine, or both of them mixed together. You'd say, I really do feel better. Heroin, cured my cough. And actually, I've looked this up. It is true. Heroin does suppress cough. I think it's a little extreme of a drug to use if you have a cough, but it is true. If you have a really bad cough like bronchitis, they'll give you codeine. If you guys don't know, codeine is a closely related drug to heroin. It's true that companies used to do this. So we had thousands of Americans hooked on hard drugs who did not know they were drug addicts and had no idea that they were even taking this stuff. The number one class of person that was a hard drug addict in the Gilded Age was white, middle class housewives who lived on farms. Because if you lived on a farm, you were pretty far from stores, and these traveling salesmen would just come to your door every month or so. And, oh, I got this big trunk, here's all these patent medicines. They're great, good for what ails you. And then you start to realize you take this stuff, it does make you feel good. You can get through the day, gives you pep and energy, takes away your headache. And when you don't take your medicine, then you get really sick, right? You'll get diarrhea and cough and runny nose and headache and everything else. So you are now addicted to this drug, basically. These magazines and newspapers finally blew the lid off this stuff and showed that it was just hard drugs that people were taking. You probably have heard that Coca-Cola initially had cocaine in it. During this time period, the Gilded Age, there was a big push against alcohol. Alcohol was known as a hard drink, and so people said, you need to take a soft drink. So a lot of these soft drinks, non-alcoholic drinks, came out. But in a lot of cases, it was like carbonated water mixed with coca leaves, sometimes even refined cocaine. And it's true, Coca-Cola was originally green because the coca leaves that were in it was not brown until later. And for a few years after it was first invented in the 1880s and 1890s, Coca-Cola, a soft drink, because it didn't have alcohol in it, was actually had cocaine in it. This, of course, changed after the Food and Drug Administration came into being. All kinds of stories about stock market swindles, right? About rich people who would do all kinds of crazy stuff on Wall Street. It used to be legal, by the way. Nowadays, if you're a corporation, right, and you're bringing all this money like Disney, you publish earnings reports every quarter, right? You say, we made $1 billion last quarter, and here's what our stockholders will gain. It was legal at that time to publish false earnings reports. You tell your investors, we made a lot of money and here's all your money, when really your business is making nothing because you're the CEO and you don't want to get fired. So you'll just lie and cover it up, right? But wait, how can you pay off your investors if you didn't make any profits? Easy. You go to a bank and you lie. You commit bank fraud. You tell the bank manager that you want $1 million loan to expand your factory. You pay your stockholders that, the fake profits, wink, wink. And then next quarter, you hope you see a profit and then you can pay back the loan. You get it? This is totally illegal today. The SEC has totally abolished this. People still do it, but they get caught and they go to prison for it. This was totally legal in the 1890s. So people did all kinds of stuff like this to make themselves rich. And finally, people started to complain and say, you can't do this kind of stuff anymore. There was this huge scandal. I can't remember if I mentioned this in the US Empire lecture because I gave it 2 years ago, but there was this very famous case of Hippolyte egg. Hippolyte egg was basically you would buy like hard-boiled eggs in a brine in a big jar. And what they discovered, this company, was that if they used this brine that was highly acidic, the eggs would keep for longer. The problem was a rather large proportion of people, 4 or 5%, would get horrible sores all over their esophagus from how acidic the brine was. So you had little kids that were eating these eggs and they had ulcerated esophagus. They were coughing up blood. Some of them were killed by it. Now, a social Darwinist would say, like a hardcore libertarian would say, well, buyer beware. That's the market working. A couple of kids die, it's published in the newspaper, and no one will buy those eggs again. And so they go out of business, right? I would say that's very cold comfort to the dead children, and that government needs to come in and make the rules of the game so that businesses don't kill people. Businesses, I'm not saying they're a bad thing, but in a lot of ways, businesses are what we would call amoral, not immoral, but amoral, meaning morality's out of the question. They exist to make a profit, and that's not a bad thing. But that's why government needs to come in and set up the rules of the game so they're not polluting the environment or making a dangerous product or whatever, right? We're very big on like product liability. You probably hear these recalls of child seats and stuff when they're dangerous, and we're very concerned about that. 120 years ago, the feeling was mostly like, who cares, right? Life should be dangerous. Kind of like how it is in Thailand today, right? I've been to Thailand and it's pretty crazy. I could tell you guys a couple of stories of this. The most incredible ones is my wife and I went to this zoo in Thailand where when soon as you walk through the door, they give you a baby tiger and you're like feeding it with a bottle and everything. Totally illegal in the United States. You can't do that stuff. Um, Partially animal rights, but partially because it's super dangerous. Um, we watched this elephant show where these elephants were trying to do all these tricks. And when the show was over, they'd invite you down. They're like, who wants to take a picture with the elephant? And I'm just like, that's a big animal. I don't want to anywhere near that, right? But tourists from all over the world would come down there, wait in line, and then the elephant would wrap its trunk around you and lift you up, and you'd like take a picture with it, right? And if you were really brave or stupid, there was a guy up there saying, okay, you can lay down on the ground and the elephant will lift its hoof and hold it right above your head and pretend like it's squishing your head. And we'll take a picture of that. And they just let you do that. Because if the elephant slips and squishes your head in Thailand, guess what? The laws don't allow you to sue. It's your risk. They just hose off the mess and they get the next, 12:30 show members in there. And they just say, well, some stupid tourist died. They don't, it's just not in the legal system there that we need protections, right? My wife and I went on this boat tour and they asked some of us if we wanted to go parasailing, and I wasn't into that either. Neither was my wife, but some of the other members of our group wanted to. And there was this young girl there. She was about 13. She's like, yeah, I want to parasail. And they're like, okay, well, if you're under 16, we do need to have sort of a guide go with you, like a double-seated one. And so they didn't have a double-seated harness for her. So they put the girl in the harness and the guide was just a man who held on above her, just held on to the ropes and just took off. And he's like 60 feet in the air, just holding on, no harness, nothing. And I swear to God, I'll never forget this. The guy was smoking a cigarette. Like he would let go with one hand and smoke and just kind of hang on to it. That's Thailand. And that was America in the 1890s. It was like, just do whatever the hell you want to do. If a mine collapses and kills 500 workers, oh, well, no big deal. Plenty more where that came from. It was a heartless kind of existence. So people started publishing all kinds of exposés on this, the history of Standard Oil. John D. Rockefeller's not only rich, but he's a crook. And here's all the evidence to prove it. He had bribed half the Senate. The Jungle was a hugely influential book. This one was not journalism, it was fiction, but it's a great book about oh gosh, I forget the country they come from, but it's about immigrants working in the meatpacking industry in Chicago at the turn of the 20th century. I think they're from Lithuania or something like that. I had to read it in high school. And this book, I will tell you, was notorious. Everybody knew it was coming. When you were a freshman, all the sophomores were like, oh my God, we're reading The Jungle. It's so gross. You guys are going to read it next year. And when you're like, oh, our teacher says we're reading The Jungle, everybody would be like, oh my God, you're going to barf. It's so gross. It is a pretty gross book. It's basically it outlines the cruelty of this system and how unsanitary and grotesque it was. In one of the chapters, they're like grinding meat, in this factory. And in one of the chapters, there's just rats just crawling all over the factory. One of them falls out of the rafters into the meat grinder, and the guy's like grinding up the meat, and he's like, uh-oh. But they don't want to get in trouble by telling the boss what happened. They'll have to throw out all that meat. So they just go, shh, don't tell anyone. There'll be a rat burger for that one. Who cares? In one of the chapters, one of the workers gets his finger caught in it, and they don't tell anybody, and it just grinds his finger off. It talks about, rats urinating and defecating all over the factory. It's really gross. It's a book where you want to lose your lunch. But like Uncle Tom's Cabin, like so many of these other books that came out, it changed the world. Theodore Roosevelt, who was president at the time, read the book and said, this is terrible, this is awful, this is disgusting. We have to clean up the meat supply. Which Upton Sinclair, the author, said, well, what about the plight of the workers? I wrote this because I wanted you to feel like they need minimum wage and maximum hours and unions and better wages. And Roosevelt's like, I don't care all about all that. I just don't want to eat a rat burger. So let's clean up the meat supply. So out of this, we get the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. We're going to skip over those Supreme Court cases because they don't quite matter as much. We're going to go on to the next one, which is social control and Victorians. So if you guys don't know what the Victorian era was, the Victorian era refers to the reign of Queen Victoria I, of Great Britain, who reigned from, I think, 1835 to about 1895. It was a long reign through pretty much the glory age of Great Britain. During her reign is when Great Britain, the sun never set on British soil. Britain basically ruled the world. And something very weird starts to happen in the late Victorian era, like in the mid 1870s. By the time Reconstruction had sort of wrapped up and the Gilded Age began, the elite in America started to not only forgive Britain for all of our problems with it, and emulate it and honor it and respect it and say Britain's just the best country in the world. It took a while after the Revolution and the War of 1812, and there were still difficulties. Even during the Civil War, we had a bit of a problem with them maybe thinking about intervening. But by the 1870s, the feeling was the US was so big and powerful, and that we were just going to forgive the British. And in fact, the idea was they're so good at running the world, and we're glad we share a language and political system with them, and we honor them and we love them. And so this culture of the middle class, the Victorian culture, sort of crosses the Atlantic, and middle class waspy Protestants in America adopt it. It was an incredibly prudish and uptight philosophy. The feeling was that middle class people in America should be honest, they should be pure, that sexual mores were very conservative, that people should not have sex out of wedlock, that people shouldn't talk about these things, people shouldn't curse. It got so uptight that these sort of Queen Victoria published these sort of guides of etiquette about like how people should behave. And literally in these books that middle class Americans bought, they said that certain words are kind of risque and we should use other words, right? Like the leg of a table or a piano leg. It was like leg is a little too sexual. It's a body part. And so we should say the limb of the table or the limb of the piano bench. And people started to buy like skirts for their piano benches and for their tables, so people would not see the piano leg because it was a little too sexy. If you guys, I hope you're laughing at this because it's so ridiculous. This is a period of time where everything was dirty, everything was terrible, everything was just awful. Photography had just come around in the 1840s, so there started to be, after the Civil War, pornographic picture books that would come out, and it was a young woman in the nude photograph. I mean, today we'd look at it and go, what even is this? It's black and white, it's blurry, it doesn't seem very sexual to us today. But at the time, a nude woman's figure in reality in a photograph was shocking to many people. So there's all these laws cracking down on pornography, on any of this kind of stuff. And this was part of progressivism as well. It was one of these things that was very big in the Gilded Age, but progressives were on board with it and even wanted stricter guidelines, which again, every movement goes a little too far in certain directions, and that goes through the progressive era as well. One of those examples was prohibition. Now, prohibition becomes the law of the land in 1920, but all during the progressive era, progressives are out marching and demonstrating to get liquor banned. And a lot of people don't know this. By 1920, alcohol was already illegal in about half of the counties in America. Maine passed a very strict prohibition law in the late 19th century. So did Oklahoma, and so did counties in various places all over the US. Mostly this was in the South and the Midwest, very much areas that were like waspy Protestant. Big immigrant states like New York and New Jersey and Connecticut and Maryland, they just thought this was silly because there were so many Italians and Germans drinking wine and drinking beer. And if you're Irish, drinking whiskey is a big part of your culture. So it was much harder to pass them there. So it began to be the struggle between native-born waspy Protestants who felt we don't drink, alcohol's evil, and these immigrants are drinking, so we have to sober them up. We have to fix them. We know better for them than they know themselves. And so women went out in the streets and marched and demonstrated, against alcohol. This is one of my favorite protest pictures of all time, right? You see, it says, lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. And you go, ooh, that's a big threat, right? Women are going to deny physical affection to their husbands if they don't stop drinking. And then if you look at the picture a little closer, you go, ooh, I don't know if that's much of a threat, right? Sorry if that's offensive, but it's people that are long since dead and I'm just making a joke. But nonetheless, women were the major foot soldiers in this movement, in the prohibition movement. Now, before, 100 years before, in the 1820s, it was temperance, right? But nobody was saying the government should shut down saloons. They were saying shut down saloons on Sundays. But the rest of the week, they said keep the saloons open. But in the churches, we should really guilt people into being sober. Now they were saying, let's shut down the saloons. Part of this was the moral implication of alcohol. I mean, it seems very silly to us today that they would want to ban alcohol. I mean, it's like the 6th or 7th largest industry in America. I don't know if you guys have read these stats, but like Dodger Stadium would disappear tomorrow without their liquor sales. They make more money off of selling beer than they do off of ticket sales. I don't know if you guys know that. I hope you don't know this because you're not an adult yet, but like alcohol is way overpriced at those venues, right? A beer is like $14. But Americans will pay it, and Budweiser makes a lot of money. Dodger Stadium makes a lot of money, and why not? You know, if you're an adult, why can't you have a beer at a game, right? 100 years ago, the feeling was it's immoral, that alcohol is the cause of all social problems. So it's why disease occurs. There was medicine was not as good as it is now. So people imagined that alcohol was the cause of literally everything. Cancer, tuberculosis, everything, which is not true at all. Certainly leads to liver disease, but it's not the root of all these diseases. People thought alcohol was the root cause of poverty, right? The poor are poor because poor immigrants are spending all their money on liquor. If they didn't do that, then they could send their kids to college. It's a bit of a ridiculous statement, but some people believe that, right? I've heard a lot of people complain today. Conservatives would say, well, if the poor don't want to be poor, quit spending $5 on Starbucks every day. And it's like, dude, $5 a day for Starbucks versus $750,000 for a house and $200,000 for college. I don't think you're going to be able to send your kid to college by giving up Starbucks. But this was the attitude of conservatives 100 years ago as well. So you had the Anti-Saloon League as well as the WCTU. WCTU became the largest women's organization in this time period. And they were very good. It was this huge umbrella organization that on the one hand, they said, we need to ban alcohol. Not a great idea. But they also said women deserve the right to vote. And they did lots of wonderful things, which this is pretty shocking. But the WCTU's official position in 1900 was to raise the age of consent in every state to 16. I don't know if you guys understand what I'm meaning or understand the implications, but the age of consent means the age at which you're legally allowed to engage in sexual relations. Today in America, that's 18 in every state. I think there's 1 or 2 states that made it 17. And in America, in most states, in the Gilded Age, it was legal for a 50-year-old man to marry a 13 or 14-year-old girl who had no control over her life, who had no income, who would just be taken and married at this young age, and then her life would just go in a completely different direction based on these other people that had more power than her. Really abominable, just awful. That's the way it was. And the WCT wanted to raise it to 16, not even 18, but 16, right? So they had a lot of good ideas, but banning alcohol, I think, wasn't one of them. The Anti-Saloon League was a mostly male-dominated institution, and it wasn't about the morality of alcohol, but it was, this is how immigrants organize themselves politically in America, is they go to their saloon, and that's how they get plugged into the system, right? That's how the political machines work. So if we just shut down all the saloons, where are they going to go? They don't have any meeting halls or anything. They don't have country clubs like we wealthy, waspy people do. And so it was sort of a twofer, right? Number one, let's stop immigrants from drinking. Number two, let's stop them from politically organizing by shutting down the saloons. A lot of it was kicking immigrants, Jews, Catholics, people from other countries that, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but in Europe, it's just no big deal to drink. Like, you go out for lunch, you have a glass of wine, you come back. In France, in Italy. I remember in Italy, I went a few years ago, and our bus driver, when we had a little lunch break, sat down and had like a glass or two of wine with his, pasta, and then got back on the bus and drove. And it terrified all of us. But they just said, well, I didn't get drunk. I had a glass of wine for lunch. I'm not advocating that America should do this by any means, but they just have very different attitudes about alcohol in Europe. You can buy alcohol at McDonald's, you can buy alcohol at movie theaters, you can buy alcohol in almost any places. It's just been in the last like 4 or 5 years that movie theaters in America started to sell alcohol because they're in danger of going out of business, right? Like, if you guys don't know, movie theaters don't make any money off of movie ticket sales. They make all their profits off of concessions. And even that wasn't cutting it. And so they decided, well, alcohol has such a high markup if we can sell it, but it seems weird to, ooh, can we like serve alcohol to people in public? And Americans are very prudish about this kind of stuff, very conservative. And it's in our history. It's a leftover legacy from this era. Similarly, anti-prostitution measures, right? I think I went over this during the era of reforms, like in the 1830s and 40s. Similarly, there were red light districts in America. Every major city in America had a red light district where prostitution was technically illegal, but the police commissioner basically had an understanding with the brothels, basically said, all right, you can own and operate a brothel here in this, like 1 square mile area. You'll paint your light bulbs red on the outside of this establishment so people will know it's a brothel. There'll be police protection. It'll be indoors. This is known as harm reduction. It's when government knows we can't totally get rid of a certain thing like gambling or running lotteries or illegal drug use or prostitution or whatever. So they sort of legalize it in a certain district and say, go here, and then we'll try to control it rather than it's dispersed in secret everywhere and we can't control it. Well, when these progressives got control of city council boards and mayoral positions, they cracked down on the red light districts, shut them down, and it didn't get rid of the problem. Prostitutes went out and walked the streets in nice Protestant areas, and they said, oh, dear God, we didn't quite think this through very much. Probably the silliest of all was commercialized leisure, meaning movies, books, picture books, things like, like what I was saying a little while ago, pornography, things like that. This is a constant thing in American society, this fight over culture and how people spend their leisure time, because we are human beings, left to their devices and leisure time, you will gratify your baser instincts. Unless people come in and sort of wipe that clean of the public square, right? And so there's a lot of talk today about video games that are extraordinarily violent or sexual. Should they exist? Should people watch that? And does that lead to a more sexualized and more violent society? Fascinating debate. I won't really chime in on that, but I don't think that's the answer, and I don't think that's a good idea. Most other societies like Japan and Western Europe, they have the same violent video games and sexualized media we have, and their violent crime rates are much, much lower than ours. Not that ours are super high, whereas ours are fairly low as well, but theirs are very low, and it's the same media and everything. So I personally don't think that these entertainment entities lead to those kind of criminal activities, but people thought they would. And so Thomas Edison very famously invented the movie projector. He patented it. He said, no one can use it unless you're showing movies approved by me. That finally broke down in the teens and 20s. And so people started to watch movies that were more violent or exciting or sexual, not by our own standards today, but by the Victorian era. And people freaked out. Oh my God, what are the immigrants going to be watching? And that's going to lead to a total breakdown of society. One good thing that Victorian progressives did was they expanded education, right? Those of you that are Cubberley Cubs, Elwood Cubberley was one of these progressive era reformers of the early 20th century who said, this education system we have, which at that point was in most areas K or 1st through 8th, he was now saying we need to go up to 12th grade, because 9th to 12th grade, for a long time, it was for rich people. It was like, if your son or daughter is going to college, you go to a prep school. So all high schools were private preparatory academies, basically. The kind where you send your kid off and you don't see them until Christmas, and they just sort of live at the boarding school, and it's very strict, but really good education. Average Americans graduated 8th grade, and that's all they would ever get. This was now saying that even the poor and immigrant deserve an education up to 12th grade before they go to college, if they choose to go to college. And so go Cubberley, right? That was a great idea. I'm a high school history teacher. How could I think different? Okay, moving to the next slide. Another big breakthrough during this time was feminism, the right to vote. Women started marching and demanding the right to vote. This started to grow and grow and grow. A handful of states were now allowing it. Wyoming in the 1870s became the first state to allow women the right to vote. Oregon in 1911, California in 1911, Washington State Montana. In the late 19th, early 20th centuries, about 6 or 7 states out in the West started to grant women the right to vote. Then some northeastern states did, and finally in 1920, we get the 19th Amendment, which allows at least all white women the right to vote. Black women wouldn't get that right to vote in the South until the 1960s, but still, white women would get the right to vote. All during the early period of the Progressive Era, women are marching and demanding this and writing, essays and everything. But you start to hear something new. There's a new technological development that had taken place known as birth control, and it was starting to be pretty reliable. Birth control had been around since the Egyptians, basically. It just was never that reliable. Now, there were certain contraceptive devices that were pretty reliable. And many women latched onto them as an expression of feminism, right? What is feminism if it isn't liberation of our bodies from male domination, right? If you're in a marriage in the Progressive Era 100 years ago or 120 years ago, you were the property of your husband, basically. This was the law of coverture. Once a woman was married, the man had complete and total control. There was no such thing as spousal abuse. Men were allowed to hit their wives and children, and it was not even considered illegal. There was no such concept as marital rape. Today, we understand that consent is something that each individual has at every moment and can relinquish that consent. So if you decide you do not want to engage in relations with your husband or wife, you have the right. That idea was laughable 120 years ago. It's like you're his wife. That's your marital duty. You have to give in to his desires whenever you want. So if you have to give in to your husband whenever he wants, and there's no effective birth control, you have no control over how many kids you have when you get pregnant and what you do with your life. If you have 15 kids, you're going to be mom for your entire life. You have no control over your body. And this is very personal to many women, as I understand. I completely get it. My mother is a nurse, was a nurse for a long time, and a feminist. And she talks to me a lot about this stuff, the way things were before, she came of age in the late 60s. This was unbelievably bad. So this woman here, Margaret Sanger, big hero to the feminist movement, she latched on to the birth control movement. And it's because she lived in a family where she was one of 11 children, and one of her earliest memories was watching her mother die during childbirth, giving birth to her 11th child at the age of 49. Now, I'm going to say something that's kind of judgy, and maybe I shouldn't be recording this and posting it on YouTube, but you guys tell me, in class, whether you agree or not. But I kind of think if you're 49 and you've got 10 kids, you're good. You're good to go. Like there's no earthly reason I can ascertain why you would want to have that 11th kid at the age of 49 when it starts to get pretty dangerous for both you, the mother, and the kid. You guys are probably aware of this. You are taking biology or just took biology, so you know that fertility starts to drop very rapidly in your 30s and your 40s. It's very hard to get pregnant, very hard to maintain a pregnancy. Miscarriages are more common, birth defects more common, Down syndrome more common, but also women's health, preeclampsia rates go up, etc. There's all these very dangerous. Childbirth is no joke. It's a very serious procedure, and it's amazing our species lasted as long as it has, considering this huge flaw. When one reflects that basically human beings, our heads are too big for regular vaginal delivery, basically. If you guys don't know this, human beings are basically born 3 months premature, right? Like the first 3 months that a baby is born, they're essentially a fetus still. There's very little development those first 3 months. The child doesn't smile, they have very few reflexes or anything. They should still be in the womb the other 3 months. Why aren't they? Because our heads are too darn big. Our heads are huge compared to the rest of our body, compared to other primates, etc. And that makes it very dangerous to deliver. Without modern medicine and modern hospitals, in 1 out of every 4 deliveries, either the child does not survive or the mother or both, 25%. Before the modern era, women didn't live long as men because women went through childbirth, and women went through childbirth many more times than they do today. Today, if you guys don't know, women live longer than men today because they only have 1 or 2 kids in a hospital with modern medicine. 100 years ago, it was the opposite. There were many widowers. There were many more men who had lost their wives than the other way around. I'm sure if you guys have ever visited a retirement home, you see there's like 8 women for every 1 man. Men don't live as long today, right? It's the opposite back then because childbirth was so deadly. So Margaret Sanger said, look, it's all about choice. I'm not telling women that they can't have their 11th child at 49. If you want to, you can, but I think women should have that choice. They should be able to use contraceptive devices to prevent, because it's their body and their life and their existence. I will tell you, young women, probably the most important decision you will ever make in your entire life will be whether you have a child and when you have a child. That determines more of your life than almost anything else. Because once that child is born, you have to dedicate an immense amount of your waking hours to that child. Unless you're just a horrible person and you neglect your kid, but you guys are all good people, you won't do that. It's incredibly life-changing, right? You guys will know this, that if you have a kid too early, you don't have time to finish school, it can ruin your life, right? Or hold you back for several decades. And Margaret Sanger is saying, also at the tail end of life, if you're like, dude, I'm done. I've had 4 or 5 kids. I'm starting to get at that age where I've talked to some of my female friends and they're just like, I'm done. I have 3 or 4 kids, I don't want to have any more kids. Maybe I'll get a tubal ligation or maybe my husband will get a vasectomy, but we're done. I have my career. I have my life. If we have 1 more kid, we might lose our house. We won't have enough money to raise the kids. And I'm just exhausted. And as a woman, don't I have that right to decide that I don't want to have this last kid? And if science allows me the ability to do that, shouldn't I have it available? Well, to many conservatives, this was the end of humanity, right? Some people get very weirded out about tinkering around with our body parts to prevent us from having kids. I don't have a problem with it. And it's really the source of the wealth of societies. And any society on earth where women are liberated and have access to birth control, the birth rate goes down, poverty goes down, women have fewer kids, and people are generally happier. But many conservatives hate it and they want to say no birth control available at all. Okay, I'm not even talking about abortion. I'm just talking about birth control, contraception, right? Now, some of you might be aware Margaret Sanger, because she created the very first Planned Parenthood clinic in the world, she's been very much maligned by people on the right. And I'll say she did create the first Planned Parenthood, but Planned Parenthood did not perform abortions in the 19 teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, or 60s. It wasn't until the 70s they started. Margaret Sanger was long dead at that point. She wanted Planned Parenthood to be these clinics where you didn't need to see a licensed doctor, who were all men at the time. You could go in and see a nurse and they'd say, here's condoms, here's how they work, or here's an IUD, here's how it works, here's a little pamphlet that demonstrates how to use it, we'll help you with it, and then you won't have to worry about getting pregnant. And she published this literature. She went out on street corners and delivered it, and she got arrested time and time and time again. She had to leave the country a couple of times and go live in Paris or London for several weeks while the heat was on and then come back, which is just amazing today that that was considered a criminal act to just talk with women about their lady parts. And it's so insulting by men to essentially say, what would you possibly know about that? Go and see a male doctor who doesn't have those parts. It's like, shouldn't women be able to, talk to each other about these very intimate facts of life and how to plan your life to attain the dreams that you want? What could be more American than that? Self-actualization, right? So that's Margaret Sanger, and that's, her struggle about birth control, which becomes more and more and more popular, and you start to see birth rates come down in America. One of the big failures of the progressive era was the complete lack of concern over Jim Crow, about racism. And you learned about that in the last lecture, just how terrible and awful it was. And I'm sorry to say there was not a single white American who stood up and said, we have to end this practice. And it's shameful that white progressives just did not seem to care about it. They gave up in the 1870s and just said, I can't be bothered with this. But there were wonderful African-American progressives that did talk about it. Ida Wells published pamphlet after pamphlet and article after article about lynching to try to draw attention to it so the federal government would offer protection. They never did, but she was drawing attention to the issue. And then there were these two gentlemen, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. So Booker T. Washington was a Black man, African-American man, born as a slave. We don't exactly even know when, because slaves didn't have birth records or certificates. We think he was probably born in 1858 or 59, just a few years. So he's just a little boy, 6 or 7 when slavery ended. He lived through Reconstruction. He saw that whole process, born in Alabama, the Deep South. And he sort of came of age right when African-Americans gained their freedom. And he saw Reconstruction fall apart. And in the 1880s, he started to become a leader of the Black community. He opened several businesses. He then, with that money, opened several Black universities like Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, which is one of the prestige, historically Black universities and colleges in this country, still is. And he started to write articles about how Black Americans should fight against racism. And he was pretty conservative, actually. What he said was, we should accept Jim Crow as far as segregation, right? Like Black people, whites will never want to live in the same neighborhood as you or intermarry with you or go to school with you. So just drop that. They're not going to ask for it. But there's other aspects of the Jim Crow system that are terrible. We should fight against political disfranchisement, meaning the literacy tests and poll taxes. That should all be abolished. Lynching definitely should go away. The sharecropping system needs to be torn down. But what he was telling Black people was, don't look for a handout from whites or from Uncle Sam. You need to work hard and do it on your own. So he preached to Black men, get married, stay married, don't have affairs, don't have kids out of wedlock, don't drink, don't waste your money, be frugal, save your money, and we will uplift ourselves through self-help. And there'll be two Americas, Black America and white America, that will be working in parallel, but not together. W.E.B. Du Bois, a contemporary of his, totally disagreed with this. He had a very different history. He was a Northerner. He was not born as a slave. He was born a bit after the Civil War, and he was born in the North in Massachusetts. So he had a very different attitude. He's a bit more militant. He's the first Black person ever to attain a PhD from Harvard, and he did that in 1895, which is just incredible when you think about how bad it was in 1895 for African Americans. This is the year before the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, and it's when segregation and Jim Crow were the law in the entire South. Going to Harvard, he talked to Booker T. Washington, and he said, look, no offense against Tuskegee, it's a fine institution, but it ain't Harvard, and it never will be. Whites have a 200-year head start on you. This university has a huge endowment with resources and former presidents that went to it. And we will just never catch up if we have to help ourselves. We need integration into white society, full inclusion. We need to go to white neighborhoods and white schools and white-owned banks, et cetera. And we need full integration inclusion, which most people, even African Americans, laughed at that. They said, that's never going to happen in your wildest dreams. It's quite interesting. W.B. Du Bois lived a very long life. I think he died in his 90s. He died in 1965, just at the fruition of the civil rights movement, just when the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were passed. So I think he proved himself to be correct in the debate in the long term, but he had to wait a long time to see that come to fruition. Both these gentlemen met in Niagara Falls with Ida Wells and several other Black leaders in 1909. And this is one of these awful, incredible stories where they decided to meet in the North. They decided to meet way in the North in upstate New York in Niagara Falls on the border with Canada. And when they got to their hotel to have their convention, the hotel told them, we didn't know when you booked your reservation that you were colored, you were Black, and we do not serve your kind in this establishment. This was in the North, the least racist place in America, and they would not serve these very distinguished and very intelligent and very accomplished Black Americans. So what did they do? They left the country and went to the Canadian side of the border where they were way less uptight about this, and they said, sure, come to our hotel, no big deal. At this convention, they established the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which seems very old-fashioned to say that term today. It's not really acceptable. It's kind of interesting how certain terms sort of change over time. When I was a kid, we just used the term Black or African American, or if we just talked about anyone who wasn't white, we just used the term minority. Now this term POC, or person of color, or people of color, is very much in vogue and come back, which is interesting to me. So colored people, not really okay to say, but people of color, much more appropriate today. And that's the case of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, this was all going on throughout America, throughout the states. States like Wisconsin were known as very progressive states. They were the first states to start to say, we need regulation of the railroads. We need welfare. Okay, welfare started in 1911 in Illinois because they had so many women whose husbands abandoned them, who just ran out on the family, and you got mom with 4 or 5 kids in the middle of Chicago, when women didn't really work or have a way to support their families. And so they started saying, if you're a woman who can prove your husband abandoned you and you have dependent children, we will give you a check every month so you don't starve. This was revolutionary. Never in American history had the government ever just given handouts to people. But the feeling was capitalism left so many people slip through the cracks. We'd have thousands of children starving to death in our cities because there's so many husbands that are just deadbeats and walked out on their wives. And so all these laws started to come into existence. And a lot of it was based on things that had gone wrong, right? There was a Galveston hurricane in 1900. There was a 1906 earthquake in San Francisco where half the city burned down. Out of the aftermath of that, you have safety regulations, clean government regulations, anti-corruption legislation that started to change the tone, and people started to say, yes, government can come in and fix these problems that capitalism presents. Capitalism's a wonderful system, but totally unregulated creates a lot of problems, and you need government to come in and fix it. This is the man who really gets the progressive era rolling. There had been rumblings about progressivism in the 1880s and 1890s, but it really explodes in 1901. So here's the story. William McKinley, elected in 1896 and re-elected in 1900, grabbed Teddy Roosevelt to put him on the ticket because he was a superstar. He was famous. After the Spanish-American War, he served as governor of New York. He wrote his autobiography, and he was an egomaniac. I love Teddy Roosevelt, but he was pretty full of himself. I had to read part of his autobiography in college, and our professor joked, and he said that the I key on his typewriter broke several times when he wrote it, because quite literally every sentence starts with I did this, and I did that, and I did this. It's really very egocentric. And because of that, he was popular. He was a superstar. Americans like a little bit of braggadocio, right? They don't want presidents going, I think you should vote for me. I'm kind of okay. I'm about as good as all the rest, right? Wouldn't that be the worst rap album title ever, right? I'm MC So-So. I'm just okay. I'm about as good as all the rest. You want people to be bragging, right? I'm the best. I'm the greatest, right? I'm the most wonderful in the world. Teddy Roosevelt was that person, and latching onto that popularity, McKinley got reelected, and then he got shot and killed. In September of 1901, McKinley went to the World's Fair in Buffalo, New York, and a young anarchist immigrant, Leon Czolgosz, shot him and killed him, basically to bring attention to the faults of capitalism, the plight of the poor, and to energize the anarchist movement throughout the globe. 120 years ago, it was not communism or anything like that scared people. It was actually anarchism. There were an anarchist shot and killed Prime Minister of Italy, shot and killed our president, and Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke of Austria-Hungary. It started World War I. An angry anarchist killed him as well. And so this guy is prosecuted. He's killed in the electric chair, but it left our president slain. And Teddy Roosevelt is now the president. Now, number one, Teddy Roosevelt was very outgoing, very energetic, not afraid at all. But also, he kind of felt, you know what, the robber barons have had presidents in their back pocket for 25 years, but they don't own me. They gave McKinley all that money, and he was their guy. I'm independent, and I'm coming after you. One of the first speeches he made, his so-called trust buster speech, he basically said, there's a new sheriff in town and I'm coming after all the big robber barons. At the time, the word for monopoly was trust. And so Roosevelt said, I'm the great trust buster. I'm going to dust off this old Sherman Antitrust Act, and I'm going to start telling my Department of Justice to go after the big rich fat cats and break up their businesses, which are illegal. And so he broke a record. There were some 42 cases prosecuted under the Sherman Antitrust Act, most of which the government won. It's weird. We had this law in the books, but like presidents were ignoring it for a long time. Or these people would, there'd be a huge merger of Rockefeller Oil with another company. It would violate antitrust laws, and they would say, well, you can get out of it if you file a form, and they would just ask for permission, bribe their way out of it. Roosevelt wasn't having it. He said, I'm coming after you. Roosevelt's biggest nemesis of all of them was J.P. Morgan. They hated each other. It was this old rivalry that went way back, way, way back. And it was almost this ethnic rivalry where Roosevelt represented the old Dutch families that came to New Amsterdam in the 1620s, and J.P. Morgan represented the waspy Protestants who came into New York in the 1660s. And that leadership had always been at odds, the Dutch and the English, right? No, Roosevelt's all American. He doesn't even speak the Dutch language, but his name is Roosevelt, and he came from these old Dutch families, and he just hated J.P. Morgan, just hated him. And the feeling was mutual. Well, Roosevelt sicked the DOJ onto Morgan and broke up a lot of his big banks, and Morgan just hated him because of that. But the people loved Roosevelt for doing this. Roosevelt intervened in a coal strike. First time ever in American history. Usually strikes happened, and they would end with one side murdering the other side. Pullman, Coeur d'Alene, Homestead, the Great Uprising of 1877. You guys know them all. This one was a huge anthracite coal strike in the Northeast in New England. We're heading into winter in 1902, where people literally will freeze to death if they don't have enough coal to heat their homes. And so Roosevelt knew this was a big problem. It was either going to end with coal shortages in America and thousands of people freezing to death, or it would end with a violent Pinkerton labor union confrontation where hundreds of people were killed. And he just said, I'm not having that. So he just politely invited the president of the labor union and the president of the coal mine to dinner at the White House and sat them down and explained to them, gentlemen, you can sit down at dinner and come to a peaceful negotiation. But if you go home and this ends terribly, I'm blaming both of you. I'm going to go out to the media and I'm going to talk to the newspaper. There was no radio or television yet, but I'm going to talk to the newspapers and I'm going to tell them that we had this sit down and both of you walked away and that the blood is on your hands. There's a lot of power that comes with the presidency, and there's hard power and there's soft power. Hard power is actually the law that allows you to do stuff, but there's a lot of soft power, right? It's why Twitter took away the president's Twitter account, because that allowed him so much power to communicate with his followers. But it's soft power. It's not the law, but you can shape public opinion. You can change people's minds about stuff. You have a lot of authority as the president because you have such a big stage. It's called the bully pulpit. That's what Roosevelt called it. And if you stand at the pulpit and shout and yell and scream and give speeches, you can control the conversation and the debate. And so Roosevelt said, that's the power I want to exercise for the people. They came to an agreed negotiation. The strike went away. And everyone applauded and said, what leadership? This is great. We don't want to have violent strikes anymore. So he became this super sensation. Roosevelt was the first American president to win the Nobel Prize for peace, which was extraordinary. He brokered an agreement to end the Russo-Japanese War. The Japanese picked a fight with the Russians basically over Korea, who would control it in 1904. And the Japanese humiliated the Russians. It was one of the few times in world history where a non-white country made war against a European white country and won. And the Japanese humiliated the Tsar of Russia, obliterated his Pacific fleet, and took Korea. Both countries had issues with Britain and France and Germany. They didn't trust them, so they went to what they saw as sort of a neutral arbiter. They went to Roosevelt to negotiate an end to this. So we invited them to New Hampshire, to the woods, to a sort of a summer retreat he had, sat him down and helped negotiate it. They ended this war and had peace, and Roosevelt got the Nobel Peace Prize. So it was wonderful. Let's see, we already did prosecuting under Sherman. Got that. Oh, sorry. 43 cases under Sherman Antitrust Act. Up here, 42 was the age of the president, right? A lot of people don't know this. Teddy Roosevelt was our youngest president ever. Now, you might say 42, that's old. Hey, be careful what you say now. I'm 41. I'm just a year off from that, right? So that's still pretty young. The Constitution says you can't be president until 35. And it takes a long time to build up your resume, right? You got to go to some fancy law school. You're going to have to practice law for a while. You got to go to the state legislature and then either governor or senator, and then you work your way up to the president. The average age of presidents is mid-50s, right? Biden is our oldest at 78. Others have been old. Donald Trump was the second oldest. But usually presidents are in their mid-50s, in that range. 42 is pretty young. Now, you might say, wait a minute, wasn't Kennedy the youngest president? Technically, no. Kennedy was 43 when he was elected. Now, some people will say Kennedy is the youngest elected president, because notice Roosevelt wasn't elected in 1901. He assumed the presidency after the assassination of the president. So he's the youngest president ever. Kennedy's the youngest elected president. Bill Clinton was 46, JFK 43. Obama was 47 when he became president. These are the younger, I know you guys are like, that's the youngest, that's still pretty old. They're presidents. They're not, heartthrobs or whatever from modern movies and stuff. So 42 is pretty young for a president. Roosevelt was a teetotaler. He never drank a drop of alcohol in his life, but he did drink a gallon of coffee a day. And yes, I did say a gallon. He broke a record for dictating memos, meaning he would talk and then his secretary would like type up all these memos. I forget how many he had, but it was in the tens of thousands of memos. He broke the record of Thomas Jefferson, who back then they didn't have typewriters, but he would dictate to people and they'd write little memos and stuff. Jefferson had the second most, and Roosevelt just blew that out of the water. He just incessantly talked and was probably suffering from ADHD. We don't know, but we have a lot of evidence to suggest that he couldn't sit still. It was hard for him to kind of concentrate for long periods. He had struggled with this his whole life, and he operated on very little sleep and a whole lot of caffeine. So maybe he should have had his medication for that. When he read The Jungle, he then convinced Congress to pass the Meat Inspection Act. So, unbelievable that in this country, as late as 1903, and even in New York City, you would go to like a meat shop and they literally would have animals alive there, and you'd pick them out and they'd go out and wring the chicken's neck in the street, and then it would, chop the head off, pluck the feathers, and give it to you. And it's like, you just killed an animal in a New York City street and left all of the waste right there. That's the way it worked. Capitalism, just unregulated, right? Capitalism, again, wonderful. But you need some regulations, like you got to do that at a slaughterhouse, right? So slaughterhouses would allow you to slaughter animals there. They can, in a sanitary way, deal with the waste. And then you have just the meat that you then take to a refrigerated unit and sell it in your store. That was now the law. And this was federal. So in every state in the union, meat inspectors in these white lab coats and helmets would come out with a little checklist and check everything off. Cities started to have health inspectors. You guys know this. You have a little grade in the window, right? That grades your cleanliness. I don't even go to a restaurant if they don't have an A. It's like B, I don't know about that. It ain't even that hard to get an A, and you go to a different one. By the way, there are many countries in the world that they don't have this. When I was in Nicaragua, the way you picked a restaurant was you would ask the locals, what is a safe restaurant to eat at where I won't get sick? Because they have no health regulations in a lot of these poor developed countries. So I do things that I hate doing, but I know that I won't die from the food. I'll like go to a McDonald's when I'm in Managua, Nicaragua. I know that I might end up getting heart disease after several years of eating that stuff, but you're not going to get like a tapeworm or, some awful infection, E. coli or something like that, or mad cow disease. Because McDonald's, I have issues with McDonald's, but they have pretty good health standards when it comes to selling meat that's clean and you won't get sick from it. Maybe I should just go vegan. I won't have to worry about all that stuff. In any case, another thing he passed was the Pure Food and Drug Act. Like I said, with all these patent medicines that were sold, he just said, we got to clean up our drugstores in America. And so this law was passed, which said, number one, Truth in advertising. You cannot claim that a drug does something unless you can demonstrate it with clinical trials. And then you can say it, right? Aspirin reduces fever. How do we know? Here's the scientific study, and the government oversaw those results. How do we know that this vaccine is effective for coronavirus and coming out? The FDA went over these clinical trials. It was pretty rushed, but the FDA is pretty good at what it does, and drug companies in America know this, and they work with them, and they have scientific studies that can then demonstrate it's not harmful and it's effective, right? And they can say so. Second, they have to make sure that it's safe, right? That there's no, certain drugs are banned, they're scheduled, right? Like I forget how the scheduling works, but it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's like some drugs are just OTC, over the counter, zero restrictions. You go into a drugstore, you buy as much Tylenol or aspirin as you want. Then there's some that are restricted a little more, right? Like if you want Tylenol with codeine or Vicodin or OxyContin, you need a prescription for that, right? And then, you have some drugs that are just totally banned, heroin, cocaine, etc. There's no medical use for it pretty much at all, in a legal sense anyway. All of that comes from the Pure Food and Drug Act. The Pure Food and Drug Act remains the most effective anti-drug control policy ever in human history. Excuse me. And it technically didn't even completely ban these substances. They just said you couldn't sell them in stores. And what it did was it liberated people with knowledge. Like I know now, because the ingredients are, you guys know, you're savvy consumers. You know, when you like look at a label of food, they'll tell you the ingredients and the nutritional information. That's the Pure Food and Drug Act, right? It tells you like what's in the drugs that you're taking. So if it's something you don't want to take, you don't have to take it. Knowledge was a great, liberator for these people. Another thing Roosevelt very much was an outdoorsman. He owned a ranch out in South Dakota. He knew how to ride. He knew how to lasso. He knew how to shoot. He knew how to camp and hike. And he loved nature. He loved going to Yosemite and Yellowstone. And he vastly expanded our national parks. He put more acres under national park control than any other president before or since. He was a capitalist. He said all this development's good, but you can't destroy completely nature for profits. You can destroy a lot of nature for profits, but certain areas will take out of private control and it will be public property, the communal property of all Americans, so we can visit this because it's our spiritual property, and we deserve to pass that on to our progeny. All right, last slide. So Teddy Roosevelt, immensely popular president. He runs as vice president in 1900. He runs for re-election in 1904 and destroys Alton Parker, the Democratic nominee, just stomps all over him. And in 1908, people started to ask him, are you going to run again? Because no president had served more than 2 terms at that point. But Roosevelt always said, I might run again because that first term didn't really count because I wasn't elected. That rule that Washington said was you can't be elected to more than 2 terms. I was elected vice president and served 3 years and 5 months as vice president, or as president ascending to the presidency. Then I was elected in 1904. So I've actually only served 1 term. I might run for that second. He started to get a lot of flack from journalists and from Republican Party members. And he finally said, I'm not going to run again. I'll just retire. And at 50 years old, he thought that he was going to retire, and that was it. He handpicked a successor, William Howard Taft, who was a very capable and smart Republican. Taft is sort of unknown as our president. He only served 1 term, 4 years, and there's not much legacy there. But he also was the only person that served as president and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He becomes Chief Justice afterwards in the teens and 20s. He was very good at that, actually, much better Chief Justice than he was a president. Taft is also our heaviest president, our most obese president. He was 310 pounds as president at his heaviest. There's a funny story about that, a couple of funny stories about that. One is that the Oval Office was built, designed, and dedicated in 1909 when Taft was living in the White House. And the joke at the time was, how'd they get the idea of the design of the Oval Office? They said, well, Taft became a grandfather also while he was serving as president. And the joke was that he was playing with his grandson lying on his back, and they just drew a chalk outline around his body and said, "There's the Oval Office. It's big enough." I know, not very nice to fat shame people, but he's been dead for 100 years. We can go ahead and do that. Another, not even joke, it's a true story. He got stuck in the White House bathtub. Like the folds of his flesh had kind of created like a suction cup effect under the water, and he got stuck and could not get out. And they literally had to like get rowing oars and like pry him out of the bathtub, which is kind of embarrassing. My favorite story about William Howard Taft, I'll have to find the picture here and show it to you guys. It's wonderful. Was that Taft was governor of the Philippines. Remember, the U.S. acquires the Philippines in 1898 from the Spanish. We annex it. It becomes under our control. And William McKinley nominated Taft to be the governor there. So he went and he took his first tour as president. So let me share this other screen here so you guys can see, but I think this is wonderful. So Taft is here, if you guys can see that. There's Taft on a water buffalo, right? I was in college as an undergraduate, and my professor was, going over this slide really quick, and just in deadpan, just totally calm voice, he, was showing this PowerPoint, and he said, "All right, students, here's a picture of the largest land mammal in all of Asia, and it's riding on a water buffalo." But get it? Because he's so big, right? And so, I know, maybe not so funny, but I thought I laughed so loud I was embarrassed at myself because I cackled like a hen. I laughed so hard. And I just feel bad for that water buffalo, man. Oof, that's a lot of pressure to be putting on that back. But that's Taft. Now, in all honesty, nice man, decent president, not a terrible president by any means. But Roosevelt, egomaniac that he was, could not stand the thought of being out of the spotlight. Roosevelt went on vacation for years in Europe. He climbed the mountains. He met with the Tsar of Russia. He met with all these big figures. He wrote books. He received all these awards. And every day he'd get a copy of the New York Times wherever he was. And he would just rant and rave about how Bill Taft was handed the country over to the monopolists and that you had to get strict with these guys. You can't just give away everything to JP Morgan. By the way, that story, I forgot to tell you how that story ended. So the last year of Roosevelt's presidency in 1907, there was a panic. There was a stock market collapse. There was no Federal Reserve at the time, so he couldn't bail out the economy itself. Roosevelt had to do the most distasteful thing his entire life. He invited JP Morgan to the White House and asked him for a favor. Would you please bail out the government? Which he did. Quite literally, JP Morgan just wrote a check and gave it to the government, and then they owed him all this money and all this power, basically. He did that another time in 1893 during that panic, and Grover Cleveland invited him to the White House and asked him for money. And Roosevelt just said, "I've had enough. I've done a lot of distasteful things in my life, but I've never had to ask JP Morgan for a favor. I hate that man, and I'm not doing this." And that was part of the reason why he chose not to run again. But seeing Taft do so little and just give away the whole country to JP Morgan, the other rich people, he said, "I'm coming out of retirement." So in 1912, Roosevelt did the unthinkable. He announced that he would run. Now, the Republican establishment didn't like him. They just said, "You've had your chance. Taft's doing a good job. No, we're not nominating." This is before you had open primaries where citizens would vote. It was just behind closed doors. Powerful mayors, governors, senators, congressmen would just meet and decide who the nominee was, and they decided on Taft. Hey, buddy. What you need? I'm recording something, so make it quick.
So, what are you recording?
I'm recording a lecture to my students.
Oh, so I wanted to ask you, are you almost done?
Almost. I need like 5 minutes, okay?
Okay.
All right, buddy. Love you. See you in a minute. All right. So, they denied Roosevelt getting the nomination. Taft got it. So Roosevelt just made his own party. He picked Hiram Johnson, governor of California, and a known progressive, to be his running mate. He founded the Progressive Party, known as the Bull Moose, because that was their mascot. Democrats have the donkey, Republicans have the elephant. And Roosevelt and the progressives were the bull moose. He ran on a very, very liberal platform. By the way, liberal and progressive mean the same thing. It's funny how words have different connotations in different times. Progressive was the term in the early 20th century, and then it fell apart in 1920 because progressivism became toxic. It became very unpopular. We'll get to that in a minute. And so starting in like the 1950s, this term liberal came out, which basically means the same thing. And then liberal was so much demonized when I was a kid in the 80s and 90s. Republicans just had to say the word liberal. And if you were a Democrat, I'm not a liberal, don't call me that. It's almost like calling someone a communist. And so liberal fell away. And just in the last 10 years or so, I've heard people on the left start calling them progressive again, because the term has been dead for 100 years. Why might as well bring it back? Roosevelt, of the candidates running, was the most progressive. He was calling for a federal minimum wage. He was calling for stricter antitrust laws, a national bank, a Federal Reserve, basically, women getting the right to vote by national constitutional amendment. He was incredibly progressive. And what it did was it split the Republican vote. Taft did win more votes. He got 38% of the vote. Roosevelt got, I think, about 20%. And this guy, Woodrow Wilson, got only about 42% of the vote. But because that was more than everybody else, he wins. The Democrats probably should not have won this race. Their party was in disarray. They were very disorganized. But because of the split between Roosevelt and Taft, Woodrow Wilson wins the election. He ends up being the most conservative of the three people running. Now, Wilson, fascinating figure. Pretty good president in a lot of ways. Not a very good high school, if you know what I mean. Just teasing. Not as bad as Lakewood, but you know. I will say this. I very much like the architecture at Wilson High School because it was built in 1927. They named it after Woodrow Wilson because he had just been president. And I like the old school campus. I think it's got very attractive architectural aesthetics, better than Millikan. Other than that, they're not that good. Now, Wilson was born in Virginia, Southerner by birth, but then moved to New Jersey. He had been the president of Princeton University, and that was it. Very interesting. He had very little political experience, highly intelligent. He had written several books and stuff, and he had like a PhD in government, but he had never actually run anything, which was weird. But he wins this election almost by accident. And he is a very staunch conservative. The Democrats were the conservative party, but it was almost like the progressive era was this giant wave that was cresting, and he had to just ride the wave. So you see, he does a lot of progressive things as president. Number one, he reduced the tariff. Remember that we had fought over this ever since Hamilton, right? The Federalist Whig Republicans always loved the tariff to protect American industries and American workers. Democrats always hated it because consumers want cheaper prices, right? Democrats lower the tariff so that, you know, prices can be lower. 4 constitutional amendments are passed during Wilson's tenure. The 16th, which allowed for an income tax. I know we don't like the income tax today, but the idea was, and I tend to agree, tariffs are very disproportionately unfair to the poor and middle and working classes, meaning you pay a higher percentage of your income than the rich do because it's on consumption. Everything you buy, there's a tariff fee involved, and you get part of that cost when you buy stuff because that cost is passed on to you. Income tax, if you do it right, you can literally say, well, people under $3,000 a year in income don't have to pay tax at all, but the rich are going to pay most of it. And that's the way it was for the first, 30 years or so that we had an income tax. Only the very rich had to pay it, and pretty much nobody else did. And that was deemed as a more fair option. What's interesting is the Congress passed an income tax, and the Supreme Court struck it down just because they didn't like it. So Congress came back and changed the Constitution to say we can do a tax on people's income. So now we have the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, that does that. The 17th Amendment allowed for direct election of senators. It used to be that just state legislatures behind closed doors would just name their senators, which was not very democratic. And so this was changed so that senators would be directly elected, so that rich fat cats couldn't just bribe off powerful people to pick people that they liked and that were amenable to their desires, right? John D. Rockefeller could say, I don't want to have any kind of antitrust legislation or high taxes, so I'm going to bribe these people to pick senators that are good for me. It'd be much harder to do that if you have to try to bribe a whole state of citizens. It won't work as well, right? Power to the people. Federal Reserve Act. We don't want to have to keep going to JP Morgan and ask him for a bailout. So why don't we have a national bank that will raise revenue and lend it out and operate the way the Bank of England or the Bank of Japan or the Bank of Germany do? Every civilized advanced country in the world had a national bank. And we hadn't had one since the 1830s, since Andrew Jackson. We had a national currency and we had a treasury, but not a national bank. Now we would, and we'd have the Federal Reserve until today. Clayton antitrust. Sherman antitrust had a lot of holes in it. In fact, it was more often used to break up labor unions than it was used to break up what it was designed to do, and that's corporations. Sherman didn't say in there that this is for corporations. He just said any entity that combines to reduce competition. And so rich people hired lawyers that said that's unions, and it's like, actually that means big business, but the law didn't say. Clayton antitrust would explicitly say labor unions cannot be broken up with antitrust legislation. Only businesses can. That was great. Keating Owen tried to get rid of child labor. One of the great failures of the progressive era was that child labor was very common back then. A lot of little kids were working in factories and coal mines, and Congress tried to pass a law getting rid of it, and the Supreme Court said, no, unconstitutional. You don't have the right. States have that right. And so this law was designed to ban the transportation of goods across state lines that are made by child labor. And the Supreme Court struck that one down too. So it's one of the awful legacies of progressivism. Nothing was done to end child labor. Child labor eventually mostly disappears in America in the 20s and 30s, primarily because those educational reforms of Elwood Cubberley I talked about, right? If you've got a 14-year-old, 15-year-old, why would you send them to a prep school? Why not just send them to college, right? And if you've got a 9, 10, 11-year-old that's like, it'd be nice if they got an education up to 8th grade, but you need them working right now because you're barely surviving. You just take them out of school and put them in the factory. But if you could get them a free education up to 12th grade and they have a chance to make much better money later, you'll do what you can to keep them in school. That basically ended child labor in America for the most part. There's little pockets of it here and there, and it still exists today, but it's, very much under the radar and taboo. All right. We get 2 more constitutional amendments at the end. We get the 18th Amendment, which was a terrible idea, but it was our prohibition amendment, a national prohibition against all intoxicating spirits. Lots of people were for prohibition who honestly thought, and they were told this by the Anti-Saloon League and the WCTU, oh, we're just talking about hard liquor like whiskey and wine, but we're never going to ban beer. Beer is very low in alcohol content. It's only 3% of the liquid in a beer is alcohol. Wine is about 14%. Hard liquors are 40 to 60%. And so most people voted for it thinking that, well, I like beer, so that's only going to punish the Irish or the Italians or whoever, the wine and the hard liquor drinkers. When the 18th Amendment was passed, immediately the Volstead Act was passed to enforce it. And the Volstead Act said that any liquid that was above half of 1% alcohol was banned. There's some stuff that's alcoholic that you may not even imagine. Is a lot of steak sauces have like tiny amounts of alcohol in it, like Worcestershire sauce, A1 steak sauce, little tiny amounts, but it's more than half of a percent. But like, I mean, you'd have to drink like 60 ounces of it to get a buzz off of it. And who's going to drink 5 bottles of A1 steak sauce? That's pretty gross, right? Things like that became totally illegal, along with beer, wine, and everything else. And it was a disaster. We'll talk about prohibition when we do the 20s. It did not work, and it actually made things worse than it was before. It was a great experiment, but it was a great learning lesson. It did not help. The second of these amendments that was much more positive was the 19th Amendment. Women marching in the streets, getting arrested, getting doused with fire hoses in the winter, going on hunger strikes, being force-fed. Just women would not relent. And what finally really pushed people in the direction of allowing women the right to vote, who didn't want to before, was that women organized and did so much good in World War I. Women were out in donation drives, bond drives. Women raised the money that won that war and went into factories and made all the weapons of war while men were off fighting the war. And women could very realistically and logically say, we won the war for this country. We demand the right to vote. We've proved our civic duty. And there wasn't much argument you could say to that, because women did raise some ridiculous amount of money. I think they raised $23 billion during World War I, something like that, which was a lot of money back then, more than we even needed. They raised more money than we needed to win the war by a huge amount. It wasn't even close. So progressivism will eventually die out in 1920. There was a huge backlash. And the story for why this was that 1919 was the worst year in American history since the Civil War, which is weird because 2020 was a supremely rotten year. We had a pandemic and all this, bad economy, turmoil, bad race relations with protests and riots and stuff. 1919 was even worse, I would say. So here's everything that went wrong in 1919. Number one, we haven't talked about World War I, but America fought and won World War I, but we sort of lost the peace. Our president said, we need to be involved in Europe, have troops stationed there forever. We need to join the League of Nations. And most Americans just said, no, we're not really into that. The Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles. America took part in the war, but never finished it up. We withdrew our armies. And what happened? Germany rearmed, and we had to fight another world war to try to solve all these European issues. President Wilson had a stroke in the summer of 1919 in September, trying to rally support for this. And he was basically a vegetable the last year and a half of his presidency, which was very troublesome. You had the most strikes in American history in 1919. There were 3,600 strikes in 1919 alone, which was way beyond anything we had even experienced. And they were very disruptive. In 1919, the Boston Police Department went on strike. Now, some of you guys may not like police that much, but if they went on strike, I think we'd be in a lot of trouble. That's just a flashing red light for any criminal to do whatever they want. And it really alienated the people of Massachusetts, because you guys got to understand, if you don't get this, by the turn of the 20th century, most police departments in most metropolitan areas in America were 100% Irish. The Irish had come to America in the 1840s and 50s in huge numbers and went to big cities like New York and Philadelphia and Boston and Chicago. And they voted Democratic for decades. And they got hired into the civil service at the lowest level. You'd never have an Irishman as a mayor or a city council member. Come on, right? They're drunk Catholics, was the feeling of most WASPy Protestants, but we'll let them be the police force, right? And they went on strike. And most of the citizens of Massachusetts just said, you lazy immigrants, we just can't. And these people weren't immigrants, they were second, third generation. But that was the feeling. Catholic immigrants are lazy and they're un-American. And people had just had enough. And there were strikes in the steel industry and the logging industry, and there were shortages of everything. And people had just had enough. They just said, you're spoiled, get back to work. Women were marching in the streets, and that was very unseemly to a lot of people, as women were shouting and yelling and acting like men out in public, walking around unescorted. That was just shocking to Victorian sensibilities, and people didn't like that very much either. There was a Red Scare. Russia had a revolution. And left-wingers in America, very encouraged by that, anarchists, socialists, communists, they started bombing places. They bombed the LA Times, which is incredible when you think about it, because the LA Times was conservative in 1919, very conservative newspaper that ridiculed communists and anarchists and socialists. And so they bombed the LA Times and killed several people, damaged a lot of offices. If you guys don't know, today, the LA Times, in my opinion, it's probably the most liberal newspaper of any metropolitan city in this country. It's more liberal than the New York Times or the Washington Post, certainly more than the Chicago Tribune. That one's a pretty conservative or mainstream newspaper. LA Times is very, very, very liberal. It's changed a lot in the last 100 years, but it was conservative in 1910 or 1919, and it was bombed. The Attorney General's home was bombed. A. Mitchell Palmer, like anarchists, showed up at his house and dropped a package off that blew off the front wall and door of his home. He wasn't home, but that was pretty frightening. A bomb was set off outside of the Wall Street Stock Exchange, and it caused a lot of damage, shattered windows, and it killed a handful of people. It could have been a lot worse, but it was terrifying. And so the government used this as a crackdown all through 1919 and even 1920. people were rounded up, and if you weren't a US citizen yet, you'd be deported. If you were a US citizen, you were sentenced to long times in prison. Even if you hadn't really done anything wrong, they were just cracking down on all the left-wingers in America. There was a pandemic that year too, and even worse than the one that we are having this year, right? The statistics last time I read are that about 360,000 people, Americans, have died of COVID-19, which is terrible, awful. But the flu pandemic of 1919 remains the deadliest pandemic on world records. There's nothing even like it. And yes, you can say, well, what about the Black Plague? It killed a third of Europe. Yeah, but Europe, there were probably only 5 million people living in Europe at the time. And maybe even less, and a third of that, the numbers aren't as big as the 20 million people killed by Spanish flu, as it was called, in 1918 and 1919. It technically starts in the fall of 1918, but it continues on into 1919, just like this pandemic is, right? COVID-19. Notice it's called 19 because it starts in December of 1919. It goes all through 2020, and it's continuing into 2021. That was that pandemic as well. It killed 675,000 Americans at a time when the US population was about a third of what it is now. So you'd have to multiply it by 3. We're talking about like 2 million deaths in America today. That's what it would be like. It was devastating. It was just awful. And people blamed immigrants because it was called the Spanish flu. Even though it did not originate in Spain, people called it that because Spain was the first country that actually wrote about the flu. Every other country that was at war during 1918 had strong censorship laws, and they said, don't publish that soldiers are getting sick with the flu. It was censored. Spain, who wasn't a belligerent in that war, started writing stories about it. So everyone's like, it originated with you and you brought it to us. Wasn't true. It actually, we're not sure where it originated, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest it originated in America, in Kansas, and then spread to the world. So this was a devastating year, just terrible. There were race riots all over the North, really deadly ones, not like the ones last summer where they start out as peaceful protests, or maybe they remain peaceful the whole time, but there's some rioting on the fringes and a handful of deaths. These deaths were in the dozens, if not hundreds. There was a big riot in Chicago in 1919, in East St. Louis, same year, in Philadelphia. Tulsa, Oklahoma had the worst one of all, where the Black section of town was literally burned to the ground. And it was because a Black man and a white woman shared an elevator ride together in a public building. They were downtown, and I don't remember the building, what it was, but in those days, really any man being alone with a woman was pretty taboo, but especially a Black man with a white woman. They entered the elevator, they rode down together. We're unclear what happened, but clearly it wasn't what people said it was. Many people claimed that this man had raped this woman and done these awful things, or were sexually assaulted or whatever. It seems that there's no evidence of that. It was just a very elevator ride was the quote unquote rape. Like, you violated this woman's purity by just being in her presence because you're so awful and wicked and terrible. And so a lynch mob was just almost formed immediately, started attacking this guy. Black people came to his defense. There was huge riots and melees, and it exploded with the police literally going in and burning down this huge section of Tulsa. Hundreds of people killed. Probably the worst race riot in American history. Why? Because so many Black people had moved to the North. Okay, we'll get to that when we do World War I, but there was a mass migration. 500,000 Black Americans left the South during World War I and went to the North for a better life, for better wages, better living conditions, etc. White folks weren't happy to see them in the North, right? I wanted you to get out of this mindset that Northerners are not racist or anti-racist. They're just racist in a different way. And that was very much shown in these violent race riots that just took the North by storm. A wave of them. Every major city had one in 1919, and they were way deadlier than the ones today. And finally, probably worst of all in most Americans' minds, was the Black Sox scandal of 1919. Now, if you don't know what this is, it remains probably the worst scandal in American sports history. In 1919, the White Sox, Chicago White Sox, were the best team in baseball, had the best record, and all of the odds makers favored them to win the World Series that year. And understand, this is a time when there's no NFL, no NBA, no NHL. Baseball is everything, and everyone loves baseball. Huge sport. Now, there's no TV or radio yet. Radio will be invented in 1920, but still baseball is huge and it's in every newspaper. In the World Series, the Chicago White Sox played the Cincinnati Reds. And what this very wealthy gangster and gambler figured out was that if he simply paid bribes to the White Sox to throw the game to intentionally lose it, and he bet on the Reds, the odds were much better. The odds were like 2-1 that the Reds, were going to win this. They were not favored by anyone. But if you bet on the Reds and then pay the White Sox, to throw the game, then you win, right? It wouldn't even take that much. You just, pay him a couple $1,000s and that was it. Now, just real quick, in defense of the White Sox who did this, professional athletes were treated terribly before about the 1970s. In 1919, the White Sox players had to pay for their own travel when they were on the road, like their own bus fare and everything like that. They had to pay for their own hotel rooms. They had to pay to wash their uniforms, and they had to pay for like meals. Even when you were in the clubhouse, in the boss's stadium, he would not feed you. You had to pay for your own hot dogs and pretzels and beer and everything like that. And so the White Sox went on strike in the summer of 1919, and they refused to wash their own uniforms until the boss did. And by about July, their uniforms had just turned completely black because they just weren't cleaning them. They just said, we're not paying for this. You should pay for it. And the boss refused. And so everyone jokingly called them the Black Sox because they had these nasty uniforms that I can't imagine how they smelled playing a baseball game. There's a lot of baseball games, 162 in a season. And so that's why they were called the Black Sox. And then the name kind of stuck later because of the scandal, right? So this guy, Arnold Rothstein, paid 8 members of the White Sox to throw the World Series and then bet on the Reds, and he made lots of money. But then the scandal started to come out. Journalists and investigators said this looked really fishy. The White Sox players seemed to be intentionally dropping fly balls, striking out on purpose. It was like, it wasn't even close. They didn't look like themselves. And after poking around and looking at their bank accounts, all of them had these huge deposits right before the World Series. It looked really fishy. An investigation discovered they intentionally threw the game. And man, what a scandal. We're so cynical these days. Like my wife and I, like, there's no innocence with us when we look at sports. Like, it's almost a joke with us. If we look at a player who was really bad one season, all of a sudden they get good. It's like, damn, how did that guy get so good? Immediately, I say, steroids probably. It's just assumed. Were you guys shocked when Lance Armstrong came out and he said, yeah, I won the Tour de France 25 times and I was doping the whole time? I go, makes sense, probably. Yeah. I mean, Barry Bonds was on the juice. So was Sammy Sosa. They broke all those home run records. I mean, that's what people do today is they let us down constantly, right? Sports scandals are just a way of life. Baseball was this pure institution. It was supposed to be uncorrupted by greed or anything else. And it seemed like this corruption had infected our sacred sport. And it was kind of almost funny the way most Americans said, look, you can burn down American cities. We can have a pandemic that can kill 700,000 Americans, but don't you mess with baseball. That's the all-American institution. And it's very unfortunate that the guy that bribed them had an identifiably Jewish name, Rothstein, right? And so it played into these stereotypes that waspy people have about Jewish people, that all they care about is money, they have no loyalty to country, and that they're, et cetera. All these awful, terrible things, which is not true at all, but it played into that stereotype, and it lent conservatives the fuel they had to say, that's it, we've had enough. This country is falling apart, and it's the fault of progressives and immigrants. We need some tough love for these people. So in 1920, we had Warren Harding, the Republican, run against William Cox. Wilson couldn't run again because he had a major stroke, and he is not going to be able to run again. William Cox basically said, stay the course. Let's, keep having unions and progressivism and all this. And people just had enough. They said, no more. We're tired of all the, there are people trying to overthrow the government with bombs. There's, people burning down cities all over the North with these race riots. There's, the Black Sox scandal. There's a pandemic that came from Spain. So they said, so no more. Warren Harding annihilated William Cox. This is the most lopsided election in the last 120 years. It's really, and really you'd have to go back to the 1820s to James Monroe to see such a lopsided election. It was unbelievable. William Cox got only about 35% of the vote. Warren Harding got 65% of the vote. Just annihilated him. It was a strong rebuke of progressivism. And what was Harding's slogan? He said, return to normalcy. Let's go back before progressivism, when baseball was pure, when immigrants assimilated, when society was better and clean, etc. Very classic backlash. He gets elected and he immediately says, prohibition, we're going to ban alcohol and just wrap ourselves in a cocoon. The US shut off immigration almost entirely. The first thing that the Republican Congress does is they say, we're not going to have immigration really at all anymore, just tiny, tiny, tiny amounts. The floodgates were basically closed and a tiny trickle of immigrants were allowed to come in. At the height of immigration in the 19 teens, there were about 1,500 immigrants a day coming into the United States. That was cut off to just like a handful a day, just 4 or 5, something like that. Ellis Island is in fact shut down in the 20s. They're just like, we don't need it anymore because we're just processing a few people. Second, we're not going to join the League of Nations. Third, we're going to pass a series of neutrality laws that say we can't even sell weapons to countries that are at war. And the highest tariffs the United States ever produced. The Republicans get back in power and they jack tariffs up to 90%. So we don't want to trade with immigrants or with foreigners. We don't want immigrants to come to this country. We don't want to sell weapons to them at war. And we don't want to be in their treaties at all. It was a resounding rebuke of all things progressive. And we entered a very conservative era in the 20s. And we'll get to that next time. Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I will see you next time. See you later.